Quick test. Picture the most Austrian song you know. If you landed on Edelweiss, the one about the small, white, clean, bright flower, I have to break some news to you. It's not Austrian. It's not even old. Two Americans, Richard Rodgers and Oscar Hammerstein, wrote it in 1959 for the Broadway musical The Sound of Music. And they did such a convincing job that actual native Austrians have since sworn they remembered hearing it in German years earlier. At one point, someone in the Reagan administration apparently believed it was Austria's national anthem, which confused a visiting Austrian ambassador considerably. Meanwhile, the actual centuries-old song that came out of these mountains, Silent Night, written in 1818 in a small town outside Salzburg, barely registers internationally next to it. We'll come back to both of those. For now, just hold on to this. A lot of what the world thinks it knows about Austria turns out to be more complicated or more American than it looks. Welcome to episode 10 of Around the World in Half an Hour. I'm Ray. Today, it's Austria, a small landlocked mountainous country that used to run a good chunk of Europe. From Vienna, spent the 20th century getting fought over and then fighting itself over how to remember its own role in the worst of it. And somehow, through all of that, kept producing an absurd concentration of composers, thinkers, and Olympic skiers. We'll cover the Habsburgs, the Anschluss, and what came after it. A very current government built specifically to keep a resurgent far-right party out of power, and why Salzburg is full of tourists, chasing a movie most Austrians can take or leave. Let's get into it. Austria covers about 83,900 square kilometers, roughly the size of South Carolina, and the Alps take up 62% of that, which tells you most of what you need to know about why this country looks the way it does. The highest point, Grossglockner, tops out at 3,797 meters. The lowest, Lake Neusiedl, over on the Hungarian border, sits at just 115 meters, out in the flat Pannonian plain that spills in from the east. Between those two extremes, you get sharply different landscapes depending on which part of the country you're standing in. High alpine glaciers and ski terrain in the west and south, gentler wine country and steppe-like plains in the east. The Danube cuts through the northern part of the country, and it's worth pausing on. It's the only major river in Europe that flows east instead of west, tracing a path from Germany's Black Forest all the way to the Black Sea, with Vienna sitting right on its banks. North of the river, older, lower granite hills mark the edge of the Bohemian forest. South of it, the Alps just keep climbing. It's a compact country, but a vertically dramatic one. You can leave Vienna's flat urban core in the morning and be deep in the mountains by lunch. Austria borders 8 countries: Germany, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, Hungary, Slovenia, Italy, Switzerland, and the tiny Principality of Liechtenstein, which puts it among the most surrounded countries in Europe. And that's not an accident of geography, so much as a leftover of geopolitics. For centuries, this wasn't a small country tucked among larger neighbors. It was the center that those neighbors used to answer to. The current borders are largely a product of the 20th century's 2 world wars, stripping away territory that used to answer to Vienna. Not a natural, ancient boundary line, which is worth remembering as we get into the history. Because Austria, as a modern, mid sized, neutral state, is a fairly recent invention layered on top of a much older story about running an empire. Celtic tribes were established here by around 700 BC, and by 15 BC, the region had become folded into the Roman Empire as the province of Noricum. Charlemagne's Carolingian Empire absorbed it in the late 8th century, and out of that eventually grew the Babenberg Margraviate, and then from 1273 onward, the House of Habsburg, a dynasty that would go on to rule Austria in one form or another for the next 6.5 centuries, marrying its way into thrones across Europe so effectively that let others wage war, you happy Austria, marry, became an actual line people used to describe the family's strategy. Maria Theresa, the only woman to rule Habsburg lands in her own right, spent the mid 1700s modernizing education, taxation, and government administration while holding the empire together through two major wars. She is generally remembered as the dynasty's most consequential reformer. The empire's shape kept shifting after that. The Napoleonic Wars, the 1815 Congress of Vienna redrawing the map of Europe from a room in the city itself, and then in 1867, the Ausgleich, or compromise, that turned the empire into the dual monarchy of Austria Hungary. One ruler, two separate governments, and a patchwork of Czechs, Poles, Hungarians, Slavs, and Austrians held together more by loyalty to Franz Joseph than by any shared national identity. That patchwork came apart for good after World War One. Austria Hungary was on the losing side. The empire was dissolved by treaty in 1918, and what remained, a small German speaking rump state that had just lost 80% of its former territory, became the first Austrian Republic, a country that struggled economically and politically almost from day one, weak enough that a majority of its own population reportedly voted more than once in favor of union with Germany in the early 1920s, only to be blocked by the same treaties that had just dismantled the empire. By 1934, Austria's fragile democracy had collapsed into an authoritarian, one party federal state under Chancellor Engelbert Dollfuss, who banned rival parties and ruled by decree, itself an attempt to keep Austria independent from Nazi Germany. Ironically enough, though, it didn't work for long. On March 12, 1938, German troops crossed the border and Austria was formally annexed into the Third Reich in what's known as the Anschluss. It happened without a shot fired. International opposition to the move was minimal, and a meaningful portion of the Austrian population welcomed it outright. What followed was a full absorption into the Nazi state. The country's name was even struck from official use for a time, and Austrians served in the Wehrmacht, and in some cases, the machinery of the Holocaust itself in numbers disproportionate to the country's small population. Here's where the post war story gets complicated and worth walking through carefully rather than glossing over. In the 1943 Moscow Declaration, the Allies described Austria as the first free country to fall victim to Hitler's aggression. After the war, the newly re established Austrian state adopted the first victim framing as its official position. Helpful, since it let the country argue it bore no institutional responsibility for Nazi crimes, distinct from Germany. Denazification proceeded only partially. Many former Nazi Party members and Wehrmacht veterans returned to ordinary civic and political life within a few years. This official version of events held for decades, largely unchallenged until 1986, when it emerged during Kurt Waldheim's campaign for the Austrian presidency that he had served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer in the Balkans during the war, a period he had not previously disclosed. The resulting international controversy, Waldheim was elected anyway and then faced years of diplomatic isolation, forced a broader Austrian reckoning with the first victim narrative that the Waldheim Affair had cracked open. In 1991, and again before the Israeli Knesset in 1993, Chancellor Franz Branitzky became the first Austrian leader to formally acknowledge the country's shared responsibility for Nazi era crimes, including the Holocaust, a position that has remained the country's official stance since. Austria's own government, in other words, has directly revised its own post war account of itself, which is an unusual thing for any country to do this explicitly, on the record, decades after the fact. On the diplomatic side, Austria regained full sovereignty in 1955 through the State Treaty, on the condition that it declare permanent neutrality, no joining military alliances, no foreign military bases on Austrian soil, a status that held through the entire Cold War and technically still applies today, even as Austria joined the European Union in 1995 and became deeply integrated into the EU's economic and political structures. Austria's population sits at roughly 9.2 million, with Vienna home to close to 2 million people, functioning as the state's only true metropolitan center. Most other Austrian cities are considerably smaller, and the country outside Vienna remains noticeably rural and mountainous. Politically, 2026 finds Austria in an unusual spot. After the far right Freedom Party, or FPO, won the largest share of the vote in September 2024's parliamentary election. Austria's other major parties spent 5 months in negotiations before forming an unprecedented three-party coalition: the Conservative People's Party, the center-left Social Democrats, and the liberal NEOS, specifically to keep the FPO out of government. Christian Stoker of the People's Party has served as chancellor since March 2025, leading what's now the first three-party federal coalition in the Second Republic's history. Polling through 2026 has continued to show the FPO leading, which makes the coalition's durability a real open question. Economically, Austria has had a rough run: three straight years of recession or near recession through 2023, 2024, and 2025, driven largely by a manufacturing slowdown and weak demand from Germany, its largest trading partner. Inflation has cooled to around 2.7%, and growth is forecast at a modest 0.8% for 2026, alongside spending cuts and tax adjustments aimed at stabilizing the budget. Despite the recent stretch of bad economic news, Austria remains a wealthy country by almost any global measure. High income per capita, strong social welfare provisions, and a standard of living, particularly in Vienna, that consistently ranks among the best in the world in quality of life surveys. Maria Theresa ruled the Habsburg lands from 1740 to 1780, the only woman ever to do so in her own right, and used that 4 decade reign to overhaul education, taxation, and public administration across an empire that badly needed modernizing. Wolfgang Amadeo Mozart, born in Salzburg in 1756, was composing recognizable original work by the age of 5 and went on to produce more than 600 pieces across opera, symphony, and chamber music before his death at just 35. Still, by most measures, the most famous name to ever come out of this country. Sigmund Freud, born in what's now the Czech Republic, but raised almost entirely in Vienna from age 3, built the foundations of psychoanalysis at the University of Vienna and reshaped how the 20th century thought about the human mind, reportedly while smoking around 20 cigars a day. Empress Elizabeth of Austria, universally known as Sisi, married into the Habsburg court at 16 and spent much of her adult life chafing against its rigid formality, cultivating an image of restless independence that made her a lasting romantic icon. She was assassinated by an Italian anarchist in Geneva in 1898. Gustav Klimt led the Vienna secession art movement at the turn of the 20th century, breaking from academic tradition toward the gilded ornamental style that produced the kiss, now housed at the Belvedere and among the most reproduced paintings in the world. And Arnold Schwarzenegger arrived in the United States from a small Austrian village with almost no English and a gym bag, built a bodybuilding and a film career from nothing, and eventually served 2 terms as governor of California. Probably the most improbable career arc on this list. Wiener Schnitzel is Austria's signature dish, and legally a specific one. Under Austrian food regulations, the name Wiener Schnitzel can only be used for a thin breaded, pan fried whale cutlet. Pork versions have to be labeled Schnitzel Wiener Art instead. Done properly, the whale gets pounded to just a few millimeters, breaded in flour, egg, and breadcrumb, and fried in clarified butter until the coating puffs slightly away from the meat. It's served with nothing more than a lemon wedge and potato salad, no sauce. Sachertorte, a dense chocolate cake layered with apricot jam under a dark chocolate glaze, was invented in 1832 by a 16-year-old apprentice named Franz Sacher. And the dispute over which Vienna establishment, Hotel Sacher or the rival Café Demel, makes the original recipe has been running for close to a century in earnest. Apfelstrudel, Tafelspitz, or boiled beef with horseradish and Kaiserschmarrn, a shredded caramelized pancake torn apart and dusted with sugar, round out the classics. None of that, though, quite captures Vienna's coffeehouse culture, which UNESCO recognized in 2011 as intangible cultural heritage in its own right. Traditional Kaffeehauser, where, per UNESCO's own description, time and space are consumed, only the coffee is found on the bill. Order a single melange and you're generally welcome to sit for hours with a newspaper, which for over 300 centuries has made these cafes genuine intellectual gathering spaces rather than just places to grab a drink. Schönbrunn Palace, the Habsburgs' summer residence, is a UNESCO World Heritage Site with 1,441 rooms and remains Austria's most visited attraction by a wide margin. The Belvedere, built for Habsburg era general, now houses Klimt's The Kiss and a major collection of Austrian modernist art. The Hofburg, the Habsburgs' winter palace in central Vienna, includes a museum dedicated to Sisi, alongside the still functioning Spanish riding school, and St. Stephen's Cathedral anchors the historic city's center. A short walk from the Vienna State Opera and the grand 19th century buildings lining the Ringstrasse. Salzburg, Mozart's birthplace, draws its own steady stream of visitors for that reason alone. But a large share of its modern tourism economy runs on the sound of music instead. Guided tours through the Mirabelle Palace Gardens and other filming locations built around a movie that, as we opened with, most Austrians regard with a shrug at best. Hallstatt, a lakeside village of under 1,000 residents with a striking alpine setting, has become so overwhelmed by visitors in recent years, many drawn by photos circulating on social media rather than any personal connection to the place, that local authorities have had to actively manage tour bus access and daily visitor caps. Innsbruck, out west in Tyrol, hosted the Winter Olympics twice in 1964 and 1976, and the Grossglockner High Alpine Road remains one of Europe's most dramatic mountain drives, climbing to over 2,500 meters through switchbacks with views back down over glaciers. Austria uses the euro, trading at roughly 1.15 US dollars as of early August 2026. Worth checking a live rate before travel, as always. This is a high income, service and export oriented economy with GDP per capita among the highest in the European Union. Though the recent 3 year stretch of recession has taken a real toll on manufacturing and export driven regions in particular, given how tightly Austria's economy is linked to Germany's. Tourism, precision manufacturing, and financial services all play major roles, and Vienna, in particular, functions as a genuine gateway for business between Western Europe and the formerly Eastern Bloc countries just across the border. Day to day costs in Vienna and Salzburg run comparable to most major Western European cities. Not cheap, but not in the extreme tier of Switzerland or the Nordic countries either. Ask most people outside Austria what this country is famous for, and you'll hear some combination of classical music, the Alps, Mozart, Vienna's imperial grandeur, and inevitably the sound of music. What's a little funny about that last one is how lopsided the fame is. The film is a defining cultural touchstone in the English speaking world and barely registers as a point of national pride inside Austria itself, where its history is generally seen as sanitized and its songs, ironically, weren't even Austrian. What gets far less international attention, Austria's outsized 20th century contribution to psychology, philosophy, and physics. Freud, Wittgenstein, and Schrödinger all did foundational work here, and a level of alpine sporting dominance that's wildly disproportionate to the country's size. Vienna's claim to being classical music's historic capital is hard to argue with. Mozart, Beethoven, Haydn, Schubert, Brahms, and Mahler all worked here, and the Vienna Philharmonic's New Year's concert is broadcast to something like 90 countries every January 1st. Johann Strauss II turned the waltz into Vienna's signature sound in the 19th century, and the Vienna State Opera still stages several hundred performances a year, being nearly destroyed in World War II and was painstakingly rebuilt. Visually, the Vienna Secession, Klimt, Egon Schiele, and the architect Otto Wagner, among its leading figures, broke from the conservative art establishment around 1897, chasing a more ornamental symbolist style that still defines a lot of what people picture when they picture Viennese art. A century later, the architect and artist Friedensreich Hundertwasser pushed in a completely different direction, designing the deliberately irregular, brightly colored Hundertwasser House apartment block in Vienna as a rejection of straight line modernist architecture. And as promised earlier, Silent Night, the actual Austrian Christmas carol, was written in 1818 by schoolteacher Franz Xaver Gruber and priest Joseph Mohr in the small town of Oberndorf, just outside Salzburg. 2 centuries old, translated into some 300 languages, and considerably less globally famous than a song about a flower the two Americans invented in 1959. Alpine skiing is where Austria has dominated on the world stage for the better part of a century. Toni Sailer swept all three men's alpine events at the 1956 Winter Olympics, a feat that was extraordinary at the time and remains rare today. 20 years later, at Innsbruck's home Olympics in 1976, France Klammer's downhill run is still shown on Austrian television every February. A white knuckle, on the edge of controlled descent, that won gold and turned him into a permanent national hero. Hermann Mayer, nicknamed the Herminator, crashed spectacularly out of the 1998 Nagano downhill, a fall so violent it briefly looked career ending, then got back up days later to win two golds in the Super G and Giant Slalom. More recently, Marcel Hirscher won 8 consecutive World Cup overall titles between 2012 and 2019, a level of sustained dominance the sport had never seen before. Innsbruck's two Winter Olympics ski resorts like Kitzbühel and St. Anton am Arlberg, and a domestic ski culture that starts most Austrian children on skis before they are out of preschool, all feed the same pipeline. Football carries real weight too. Austria qualified for the 2026 World Cup, and motorsport has its own local legend in three-time Formula One champion Niki Lauda, who survived a horrific 1976 crash and came back to race again within 6 weeks. The version of Austria most outsiders carry around, Alpine, musical, imperial, vaguely sound of music shaped, is real as far as it goes. But it flattens a country that spent the back half of the 20th century doing something fairly uncommon, publicly, officially revisiting its own account of its worst chapter, decades after the fact, rather than letting the original convenient version stand unchallenged. First time visitors are often surprised by how modern and economically serious Austria actually is behind the postcard imagery. A country that still holds a unique, self declared position of permanent military neutrality while being fully embedded in the EU's economic and political core. What Austria does well and gets comparatively little global credit for, a public transit and social welfare system that consistently ranks among Europe's best, and a sporting and scientific track record wildly out of proportion to a population of just over 9 million. What the country is actively navigating right now, in full public view, is the same tension playing out across much of Europe: a resurgent far right party polling ahead of its rivals, and a coalition of everyone else built specifically to hold the line against it, with no guarantee of how long that holds. So, Edelweiss or Silent Night, one of the Austria most of the world thinks it knows. Warm, familiar, and it turns out manufactured somewhere else entirely. The other is the real thing, 2 centuries old, quietly enormous in scale and far less famous than the imposter. That gap between the version of a place that travels well and the version that's actually true runs through pretty much everything in this episode, from a national identity myth that took until 1991 to formally correct, to a movie industry built in Salzburg around a film most locals shrug at. Next time, we trade the Alps for the Atlantic and head to the Bahamas. Thanks for listening to Around the World in Half an Hour. If you enjoyed this one, follow the show and leave a review. It genuinely helps people find us. Until next Monday.